Welcome to Thueringer for Farming Simulator 15. We now continue in our reading of The Octopus, A Story of California by Frank Norris, Chapter 1. A covered colonnade paved with round, worn bricks from whence opened the doors of the abandoned cells once used by the monks adjoined it on the left. The roof was of tiled half-cylinders split longitudinally and laid in alternate rows, now concave, now convex. The main body of the church itself was at right angles to the colonnade, and at the point of intersection rose the belfry tower, an ancient campanile, where swung the three cracked bells, the gift of the King of Spain. Beyond the church was the mission garden and the graveyard that overlooked the seed ranch in a little hollow beyond. Presley and Vanamy went down the long colonnade to the last door next to the belfry tower, and Vanamy pulled the leather thong that hung from a hole in the door, setting a little bell jangling somewhere in the interior. The place, but not for this noise, was shrouded in a Sunday stillness and absolute repose. Only at intervals one heard the trickle of the unseen fountain and the liquid cooing of doves in the garden. Father Soria opened the door. He was a small man, somewhat stout, with a smooth and shiny face. He wore a frock coat that was rather dirty, slippers, and an old yachting cap of blue cloth with a broken leather visor. He was smoking a cheap cigar, very fat and black. But instantly he recognized Vanamy. His face went all alight with pleasure and astonishment. It seemed as if he would never have finished shaking both his hands, and, as it was, he released but one of them, patting him affectionately on the shoulder with the other. He was voluble in his welcome, talking partly in Spanish, partly in English. So he had come back again, this great fellow, tanned as an Indian, lean as an Indian, with an Indian's long black hair. But he had not changed, not in the very least. His beard had not grown an inch. Aha, the rascal! Never to give warning, to drop down, as it were, from out the sky. Such a hermit! To live in the desert, a veritable Saint Jerome. Did a lion feed him down there in Arizona, or was it a raven, like Elijah? The good God had not fattened him at any rate, and apropos, he was just about to dine himself. He had made a salad from his own lettuce. The two would dine with him, eh? For this, my son, that was lost is found again. But Presley excused himself. Instinctively, he felt that Soria and Vanamy wanted to talk of things concerning which he was an outsider. It was not at all unlikely that Vanamy would spend half the night before the high altar in the church. He took himself away, his mind still busy with Vanamy's extraordinary life and character. But as he descended the hill, he was startled by a prolonged and raucous cry, discordant, very harsh, thrice repeated at exact intervals, and, looking up, he saw one of Father Soria's peacocks balancing himself upon the topmost wire of the fence, his long tail trailing, his neck outstretched, filling the air with his stupid outcry for no reason than the desire to make a noise. About an hour later, toward 4 in the afternoon, Presley reached the spring at the head of the little canyon in the northeast corner of the Quinsabe Ranch, the point toward which he had been traveling since early in the forenoon. The place was not without its charm. Innumerable live oaks overhung the canyon and Broderson Creek. There, a mere rivulet, running down from the spring, gave a certain coolness to the air. It was one of the few spots thereabouts that had survived the dry season of the last year. Nearly all the other springs had dried completely, while Mission Creek on Derek's ranch was nothing better than a dusty cutting in the ground filled with brittle, concave flakes of dried and sun-cracked mud. Presley climbed to the summit of one of the hills, the highest, that rose out of the canyon, from the crest of which he could see for 30, 50, 60 miles down the valley, and, filling his pipe, smoked lazily for upwards of an hour, his head empty of thought, allowing himself to succumb to a pleasant, gentle initiation, a little drowsy, comfortable in his place, prone upon the ground, warmed just enough by such sunlight as filtered through the live oaks, soothed by the good tobacco and the prolonged murmur of the spring and creek. By degrees, the sense of his own personality became blunted. The little wheels and cogs of thought moved slower and slower. Consciousness dwindled to a point. The animal in him stretched itself, purring. A delightful numbness invaded his mind and his body. He was not asleep. He was not awake. Stupefied merely, lapsing back to the state of the fawn, the satyr. After a while, rousing himself a little, he shifted his position, and drawing from the pocket of his shooting coat his little tree-calf edition of the Odyssey, read far into the 21st book, where, after the failure of all the suitors to bend Ulysses' bow, it is finally put with mockery into his own hands. Abruptly, the drama of the story roused him from all his languor. In an instant he was the poet again, his nerves tingling, alive to every sensation, responsive to every impression. The desire of creation, of composition, grew big within him. Hexameters of his own clamored tumultuous in his brain. Not for a long time had he felt his poem, as he called this sensation, so poignantly. For an instant he told himself that he actually held it. It was, no doubt, Vanamie's talk that had stimulated him to this point. The story of the long trail, with its desert and mountain, its cliff dwellers, its Aztec ruins, its color, movement, and romance filled his mind with picture after picture. The epic defiled before his vision like a pageant. Once more he shot a glance about him, as if in search of the inspiration, and this time he all but found it. He rose to his feet, looking out and off below him. As from a pinnacle, Presley, from where he now stood, dominated the entire country. The sun had begun to set. Everything in the range of his vision was overlaid with a sheen of gold. First, close at hand, it was the Seed Ranch, carpeting the little hollow behind the mission with a spread of greens, some dark, some vivid, some pale, almost to yellowness. Beyond that was the mission itself, its venerable campanile, in whose arches hung the Spanish king's bells, already glowing ruddy in the sunset. Farther on, he could make out Annixter's ranch house, marked by the skeleton-like tower of the artesian well, and a little farther to the east, the huddled, tiled roofs of Guadalajara. Far to the west and north, he saw Bonneville very plain, and the dome of the courthouse, a purple silhouette against the glare of the sky. Other points detached themselves, swimming in a golden mist, projecting blue shadows far before them. The mammoth live oak by the Hoovens, towering superb and magnificent, the line of eucalyptus trees, behind which he knew was the Los Muertos ranch house, his home. The watering tank, the great iron-hooped tower of wood that stood at the joining of the lower road and the county road, the long windbreak of the poplar trees, and the white walls of Carraher's saloon on the county road. But all this seemed to be only foreground, a mere array of accessories, a mass of irrelevant details. Beyond Annixter's, beyond Guadalajara, beyond the lower road, beyond Broderson Creek, on to the south and west, infinite, illimitable, stretching out there under the sheen of the sunset forever and ever, flat, fast, unbroken, a huge scroll, unrolling between the horizons, spread the great stretches of the ranch of Los Muertos, bare of crops, shaved close in the recent harvest. Near at hand were hills, but on that far southern horizon only the curve of the great earth itself checked the view. Adjoining Los Muertos and widening to the west opened the Broderson Ranch. The Osterman Ranch to the northwest carried on the great sweep of landscape, ranch after ranch. Then, as the imagination itself expanded under the stimulus of that measureless range of vision, even those great ranches resolved themselves into mere foreground, mere accessories, irrelevant details. Beyond the fine line of the horizons, over the curve of the globe, the shoulder of the earth, were other ranches, equally vast, and beyond these others, and beyond these still others, the immensities multiplying, lengthening out vaster and vaster. The whole gigantic sweep of the San Joaquin expanded, titanic, before the eye of the mind, flagellated with heat, quivering and shimmering under the sun's red eye. At long intervals, a faint breath of wind out of the south passed slowly over the levels of the baked and empty earth, accentuating the silence, marking off the stillness. It seemed to exhale from the land itself a prolonged sigh, as of deep fatigue. It was the season after the harvest, and the great earth, the mother, after its period of reproduction, its pains of labor, delivered of the fruit of its loins, slept the sleep of exhaustion. The infinite repose of the Colossus, benignant, eternal, strong, the nourisher of nations, the feeder of an entire world. Ah! There it was, his epic, his inspiration, his west, his thundering progression of hexameters. A sudden uplift, a sense of exhilaration, of physical exaltation appeared abruptly to sweep presently from his feet. As from a point high above the world, he seemed to dominate a universe, a whole order of things. He was dizzied, stunned, stupefied, his morbid supersensitive mind reeling, drunk with the intoxication of mere immensity. Stupendous ideas for which there were no names drove headlong through his brain. Terrible, formless shapes, vague figures, gigantic, monstrous, distorted, whirled at a gallop through his imagination. He started homeward, still in his dream, descending from the hill, emerging from the canyon, and took the shortcut straight across the King Sabe Ranch, leaving Guadalajara far to his left. He tramped steadily on through the wheat stubble, walking fast, his head in a whirl. Never had he so nearly grasped his inspiration as at that moment on the hilltop. Even now, though the sunset was fading, though the wide reach of valley was shut from sight, it still kept him company. Now the details came thronging back, the component parts of his poem, the signs and symbols of the West. It was there, close at hand. He had been in touch with it all day. It was in the centenarian's vividly colored reminiscences. De la Cuesta, holding his grant from the Spanish crown, with his power of life and death, the romance of his marriage, the white horse with its pillion of red leather and silver bridle mountings, the bullfights in the plaza, the gifts of gold dust to the horses and tallow. It was in Vanamy's strange history, the tragedy of his love, Angele Varian with her marvelous loveliness, the Egyptian fullness of her lips, the perplexing upward slant of her violet eyes, bizarre, oriental, her white forehead made three-cornered by her plaits of gold hair. The mystery of the other, her death at the moment of her child's birth. It was in Vanamy's flight into the wilderness, the story of the long trail, the sunsets behind the altar-like mesas, the baking desolation of the deserts, the strenuous, fierce life of forgotten towns, down there, far off, lost below the horizons of the Southwest, the sonorous music of unfamiliar names, Guihatoa, Unita, Sonora, Laredo, Uncompahgre. It was in the mission, with its cracked bells, its decaying walls, its venerable sundial, its fountain and old garden, and in the mission fathers themselves, the priests, the padres, planting the first wheat and oil and wine to produce the elements of the sacrament, a trinity of great industries taking their rise in a religious rite. Abruptly, as if in confirmation, Presley heard the sound of a bell from the direction of the mission itself. It was the De Profundis, a note of the old world, of the ancient regime, an echo from the hillsides of medieval Europe, sounding there in this new land, unfamiliar and strange at this end of the century time. By now, however, it was dark. Presley hurried forward. He came to the line fence of the Kings Abe Ranch. Everything was very still. The stars were all out. There was not a sound other than the De Profundis, still sounding from very far away. At long intervals, the great earth sighed dreamily in its sleep. All about, the feeling of absolute peace and quiet and security and untroubled happiness and content seemed descending from the stars like a benediction. The beauty of his poem, its idyll, came back to him like a caress. That alone had been lacking. It was that, perhaps, which had left it hitherto incomplete. At last he was to grasp his song in all its entirety. But suddenly there was an interruption. Presley had climbed the fence at the limit of the Kings Abe Ranch. Beyond was Los Muertos, but between the two ran the railroad. He had only time to jump back upon the embankment when, with a quivering of all the earth, a locomotive, single, unattached, shot by him with a roar, filling the air with the reek of hot oil, vomiting smoke and sparks, its enormous eyes cyclopean, red, throwing a glare far in advance, shooting by in a sudden crash of confused thunder, filling the night with the terrific clamor of its iron hoofs. Abruptly, Presley remembered. This must be the crack passenger engine of which Dyke had told him, the one delayed by the accident on the Bakersfield division and for whose passage the track had been opened all the way to Fresno. Before Presley could recover from the shock of the eruption, while the earth was still vibrating, the rails still humming, the engine was far away, flinging the echo of its frantic gallop over all the valley. For a brief instant, it roared with a hollow diapason on the long trestle over the Broderson Creek, then plunged into a cutting further on, the quivering glare of its fires losing itself in the night, its thunder abruptly diminishing to a subdued and distant humming. All at once this ceased. The engine was gone. But the moment the noise of the engine lapsed, Presley, about to start forward again, was conscious of a confusion of lamentable sounds that arose into the night from out the engine's wake. Prolonged cries of agony, sobbing wails of infinite pain, heart-rending, pitiful. The noises came from a little distance. He ran down the track, crossing the culvert, over the irrigating ditch, and at the head of the long reach of track, between the culvert and the long trestle, paused abruptly, held immovable at the sight of the ground and rails all about him. In some way the herd of sheep, Vanamy's herd, had found a breach in the wire fence by the right-of-way and had wandered out upon the tracks. A band had just been crossing at the moment of the engine's passage. The pathos of it was beyond expression. It was a slaughter, a massacre of innocents. The iron monster had charged full into the midst, merciless, inexorable. To the right and left, all the width of the right-of-way, the little bodies had been flung. Backs were snapped against the fence posts, brains knocked out. Caught in the barbs of the wire, wedged in, the bodies hung suspended. Underfoot it was terrible. The black blood, winking in the starlight, seeped down into the clinkers between the ties with a prolonged sucking murmur. Presley turned away, horror-struck, sick at heart, overwhelmed with a quick burst of irresistible compassion for this brute agony he could not relieve. The sweetness was gone from the evening. The sense of peace, of security, and placid contentment was stricken from the landscape. This hideous ruin in the engine's path drove all thought of his poem from his mind. The inspiration vanished like a mist. The De Profundis had ceased to ring. He hurried on across the Los Muertos ranch, almost running, even putting his hands over his ears, till he was out of hearing distance of that all but human distress. Not until he was beyond earshot did he pause, looking back, listening. The night had shut down again. For a moment the silence was profound, unbroken. Then, faint and prolonged across the levels of the ranch, he heard the engine whistling for Bonneville. Again and again, at rapid intervals in its flying course, it whistled for road crossings, for sharp curves, for trestles, ominous notes, hoarse, bellowing, ringing with the accents of menace and defiance. And abruptly Presley saw again in his imagination the galloping monster, the terror of steel and steam, with its single eye, cyclopean red, shooting from horizon to horizon, but saw it now as the symbol of a vast power, huge, terrible, flinging the echo of its thunder all over the reaches of the valley, leaving blood and destruction in its path. The Leviathan, with tentacles of steel, clutching into the soil, the soulless force, the iron-hearted power, the monster, the colossus, the octopus. Chapter 2. On the following morning, Heron Derrick was up and about by a little after 6 o'clock, and a quarter of an hour later had breakfast in the kitchen of the ranch house, preferring not to wait until the Chinese cook laid the table in the regular dining room. He scented a hard day's work ahead of him and was anxious to be at it betimes. He was practically the manager of Los Muertos, and, with the aid of his foreman and 3 division superintendents, carried forward nearly the entire direction of the ranch, occupying himself with the details of his father's plans, executing his orders, signing contracts, paying bills, and keeping the books. For the last 3 weeks, little had been done. The crop, such as it was, had been harvested and sold, and there had been a general relaxation of activity for upwards of a month. Now, however, the fall was coming on, the dry season was about at its end. Any time after the 20th of the month, the first rains might be expected, softening the ground, putting it into condition for the plow. 2 days before this, Heron had notified his superintendents on 3 and 4 to send in such grain as they had reserved for seed. On 2, the wheat had not even shown itself above the ground, while on 1, the home ranch, which was under his own immediate supervision, the seed had already been graded and selected. It was Heron's intention to commence bluestoning his seed that day, a delicate and important process which prevented rust and smut appearing in the crop when the wheat should come up. But, furthermore, he wanted to find time to go to Guadalajara to meet the governor on the morning train. His day promised to be busy. But as Heron was finishing his last cup of coffee, Phelps, the foreman on the home ranch, who also looked after the storage barns where the seed was kept, presented himself, cap in hand, on the back porch by the kitchen door. "I thought I'd speak to you about the seed from 4, sir," he said. "That hasn't been brought in yet." Heron nodded. I'll see about it. You've got all the bluestone you want, have you, Phelps?" And without waiting for an answer, he added, "Tell the stableman I shall want the team about 9 o'clock to go to Guadalajara. Put them in the buggy, the bays, you understand." When the other had gone, Heron drank off the rest of his coffee and, rising, passed through the dining room and across a stone-paved hallway with a glass roof into the office just beyond. The office was the nerve center of the entire 10,000 acres of Los Muertos, but its appearance and furnishings were not in the least suggestive of a farm. It was divided at about its middle by a wire railing painted green and gold, and behind this railing were the high desks where the books were kept, the safe, the letterpress and letter files, and Heron's typewriting machine. A great map of Los Muertos with every watercourse, depression, and elevation, together with indications of the varying depths of the clays and loams in the soil, accurately plotted, hung against the wall between the windows, while near at hand by the safe was a telephone. But no doubt the most significant object in the office was the ticker. This was an innovation in the San Joaquin, an idea of shrewd, quick-witted young annexter, which Heron and Magnus de Eric had been quick to adopt, and after them Broderson and Osterman, and many others of the wheat growers of the county. The offices of the ranches were thus connected by wire with San Francisco, and through that city with Minneapolis, Duluth, Chicago, New York, and at last, the most important of all, with Liverpool. Fluctuations in the price of the world's crop during and after the harvest thrilled straight to the office of Los Muertos, to that of the Quinsabe, to Osterman's, and to Broderson's. During a flurry in the Chicago wheat pits in the August of that year, which had affected even the San Francisco market, Heron and Magnus had sat up nearly half of one night watching the strip of white tape jerking unsteadily from the reel. At such moments, they no longer felt their individuality. The ranch became merely the part of an enormous whole, a unit in the vast agglomeration of wheat land the whole world around, feeling the effects of causes thousands of miles distant, a drought on the prairies of Dakota, a rain on the plains of India, a frost on the Russian steppes, a hot wind on the llanos of the Argentine. Heron crossed over to the telephone and rang 6 bells, the call for the division house on 4. It was the most distant, the most isolated point on all the ranch, situated at its far southeastern extremity, where few people ever went. Close to the line fence, a dot, a speck, lost in the immensity of the open country. By the road, it was 11 miles distant from the office, and by the trail to Hooven's and the lower road, all of 9. "How about that seed?" demanded Heron when he had got Cutter on the line. The other made excuses for an unavoidable delay and was adding that he was on the point of starting out when Heron cut in with, "You had better go the trail. It will save a little time, and I'm in a hurry. Put your sacks on the horses' backs. And Cutter, if you see Hooven when you go by his place, tell him I want him. And by the way, take a look at the end of the irrigating ditch when you get to it. See how they're getting along there, and if Billy wants anything. Tell him we are expecting those new scoops down tomorrow or next day, and to get along with what he has until then. How's everything on 4? All right then. And give your seed to Phelps when you get here if I am not about. I am going to Guadalajara to meet the governor. He's coming down today, and that makes me think. We lost the case, you know. I had a letter from the governor yesterday. Yes, hard luck. S. Behrman did us up. Well, goodbye, and don't lose any time with that seed. I want to bluestone today." After telephoning Cutter, Heron put on his hat, went over to the barns, and found Phelps. Phelps had already cleaned out the vat, which was to contain the solution of bluestone, and was now at work regrading the seed. Against the wall behind him ranged the row of sacks. Heron cut the fastenings of these and examined the contents carefully, taking handfuls of wheat from each and allowing it to run through his fingers, or nipping the grains between his nails, testing their hardness. The seed was all of the white varieties of wheat and of a very high grade, the berries hard and heavy, rigid and swollen with starch. "If it was all like that, sir, hey?" observed Phelps. Heron put his chin in the air. "Bread would be as good as cake then," he answered, going from sack to sack, inspecting the contents and consulting the tags affixed to the mouths. "Hello," he remarked. "Here's a red wheat. Where did this come from?" That's the red Clausen we sowed to the piece on 4, north of Mission Creek, just to see how it would do here. We didn't get a very good catch." "We can't do better than to stave a white Sonora and Propo," remarked Heron. "We've got our best results with that, and European millers like it to mix with the eastern wheats that have more gluten than ours. That is, if we have any wheat at all next year." A feeling of discouragement for the moment bore down heavily upon him. At intervals this came to him, and for the moment it was overpowering. The idea of "what's the use?" was upon occasion a veritable oppression. Everything seemed to combine to lower the price of wheat. The extension of wheat areas always exceeded increase of population. Competition was growing fiercer every year. The farmers' profits were the object of attack from a score of different quarters. It was a flock of vultures descending upon a common prey. The commission merchant, the elevator combine, the mixing house ring, the banks, the warehouse men, the laboring man, and above all the railroad. Steadily the Liverpool buyers cut and cut and cut. Everything, every element of the world's markets tended to force down the price to the lowest possible figure at which it could be profitably farmed.